still, 30 years later, inspiring yet other new farmers. Eliot?
That's great. Thank you, Carl. It was as much fun for me to hang out with Carl as anybody I met when I came here. I didn't grow up on a farm. I grew up in a suburban setting. But I always had a sense of adventure. And whenever I could, I got away from that to either go hiking, climbing, mountaineering, skiing. I was a ski racer for many years. I rode a bicycle all the way across the U.S. I got into whitewater kayak racing and would run any river I could find. And one day, long on about my mid-20s, I read a book about small farming, and it made it sound like an adventure. And at that point, I was a teacher, and I used to spend all my vacations running rivers or climbing mountains. And I decided, wow, why don't I spend the next summer vacation growing food and see if this is as much fun as this book makes it out to be. And it turned out that it was so much fun, I quit teaching and became a farmer. The Winter Harvest. Everybody always asks how I got into it. Basically, it was an extreme dislike of Californians. The idea that every fall I would turn all my business over to people who are all beautiful and know how to surf and hang out with movie stars. I mean, you know, what's not to dislike? So I just decided that that wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to see if we couldn't just keep pushing this envelope further into the fall and earlier in the spring. My degree, when I got out of college and graduate school, was a master's degree in Spanish literature. And the reason I chose that was that I'd been spending summers running a ski lodge in Chile so I could ski year-round, because that was still part of the adventure period. No, my degree had nothing to do with farming, but it's an interesting concept, because I think if I had studied agriculture in college, given what conventional agriculture thinks, they would have convinced me from the start that what I do every day now is impossible. And it turns out that it isn't impossible, and they were wrong. One evening at dinner a number of years ago, my daughter Melissa, who was in the 9th grade, told me how glad she was that I was an organic farmer. I remember thinking how great that was, that she was beginning to understand these concepts, that she recognized the importance of these ideas. But instead of saying, thank you, I made the mistake of asking her why she was glad I was an organic farmer. Well, she said, because organic is cool. I mean, if you were just an ordinary farmer, I couldn't hold my head up among my friends. Voles, the meadow vole, man, these guys, yeah. I occasionally look like Bill Murray in Caddyshack out there, I tell you. Man. And we tried everything. We tried every imaginable bait. We even got into macadamia nut butter. We thought maybe these guys had expensive taste. That actually worked, but all the baits after the second or third vole, you don't get another one. And you know, the word is that the third or fourth vole comes along, goes, oh yeah, last time I smelled that, Uncle Harry bought the farm, and that's it. They don't touch it again. So we figured this out. We built these little wooden boxes, and we did everything to make them real. This is a very rough file, making it look like a mouse. I actually made that hole. I started on a rented piece of land while I was still teaching. And that was great because it's nice to have an income, a day job when you're trying to get into something that as new as farming was for me. But it turned out that the farming part of it, the organic farming part of it, using compost and using natural systems to grow food, was so simple. And this is very amusing. I was in New Hampshire at the time. I knew a lot of the old locals who lived around there, and a lot of them worked for the college where I was teaching. And they knew where I lived. They used to pass it and would stop by. And when I started gardening that first summer, here were the old-timers coming over to ask this beginner my gosh, how did you grow that? And that was the point when I realized, gee, I bet it's actually easier to do it this way. And the reason you don't hear about it, and I became aware of this right from the start, is I'm not buying anything. You can't sell me this. The world's best fertilizer, compost, which I was using, I was lucky when I started that there was a horse farm nearby with a huge pile of composted horse manure so I could start right off. But compost is made for free in your backyard from waste products. And so there's actually no reason for any economic system to push this concept because there's no business in it for anybody but the farmer. There's nothing to sell me. And that was the most fun, the idea that I was independent, the idea that I was autonomous, the idea that the soil, the natural world, was giving me everything I needed as inputs for this system. I mean, talk about feeling like, oh, okay, this place really is well designed, isn't it? And it's only because an awful lot of people haven't been paying attention to that we think there are difficulties.
Yeah, we have the same concrete pad with radiant heat, but we find that on the edges it gets really cold. Do you insulate? I don't see any.
Yeah. Along the edges, we off the header of the tubes that went under the concrete floor, we took off 2 extra pipes and ran them around the edge of the greenhouse, and that made all the difference. Just to we were aware of that too. Yeah.
Is your slab temperature the controlling temperature or the air temperature?
Good question. We didn't put tunnels over these guys because we figured, they're normally in cold water, and we're just giving them the warm feet to get them going. And which one made the difference, I don't know. I think we do an awful lot of research for a bunch of amateurs, and we try not to stray into stuff where we really don't know what we're about. Yeah, Jake.
Eliot, a lot of us with tomatoes have ground heat in the tomato houses, and I'm wondering whether you've done anything with that, with using that heat system in the winter.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jake. The 2 things we have never done anything with have been artificial light, because we just don't think human beings know or are able to put into light bulbs everything that should be there, and we didn't want to do it artificially, and ground heat. And we've been very tempted by ground heat, but nowhere in nature can I find a situation where the soil is warmer in the air in the middle of winter. And for the most part, we've been trying to keep our production natural, because everybody said at the start, oh, you're going to have problems with nitrates and all these things. And so we communicated with all our friends in Europe who researched that, and they all said, listen, you're growing with no heat and you're using compost and alfalfa meal, no problem. Part of the background on improvements comes from having a desire to do something better than has ever been done before. And that part of me in farming was greatly influenced by my old passion for rock climbing. And it's an interesting thing. I've been on a lot of rock climbs where friends could walk up the backside and meet us on top for lunch. So what were we doing going up the difficult way? Well, it was a challenge, and we were trying to figure out, okay, can this challenge be solved? And once I got into agriculture, there were all these wonderful challenges. Okay, can I grow more of these per square foot? Or can I grow a better tasting spinach? Or am I doing this as well as it could be done? And so that naturally led me to the library to see what anybody had figured out about this before, what had been written about it. And the more I got involved in that, the more I realized where there was good information and where there was almost none, because no one except me possibly had ever puzzled about getting up that particular cliff. And so in those cases, we just run little trials on our farm. And I remember when we started out, we had access, where I was living in Maine, to a bunch of different potential soil improvers. There were autumn leaves, which we could rake up anywhere around. There was spoiled hay. I had a lot of neighbors making hay. There was always some that got spoiled. There were different manures from different farms where we could get composted manure. And there was seaweed from the coast. And so when the early years, I just took a field and divided it into 4 strips. And I'd put spoiled hay in one strip and tilled autumn leaves in another strip and tilled manure in a 3rd strip and put seaweed on a 4th strip. And then the following spring, I just cross-planted all the crops I was interested. So they ran across all 4 strips. And we saw, oh, isn't that fascinating? Look at how well the beets are doing in the seaweed. And my gosh, doesn't the cabbage look awful there? But by golly, it looks beautiful over in the autumn leaves. I wonder what the difference is. And so we would send soil samples off to a friend at the university who would tell us what was going on in the different thing. And then we put 2 and 2 together and hopefully came up with 4 and found ways to grow different crops, found ways to set up rotations so the crop the year before was having a beneficial effect on the crop the next year because of what it left in the soil or what it did to the soil. I mean, we just had fun. I mean, this was neat. This was like peeking into the secret world of nature and finding out that it is so elegantly designed that it surprised us day after day that everybody we knew wasn't fascinated by the exact same thing. Barbara Kingsolver wrote a very amusing paragraph about her experience of celebrating the rural in a world that has totally devalued it. And she said, "In my professional life, I've learned that as long as I write novels and nonfiction books about strictly human conventions and constructions, I'm taken seriously. But when my writing strays into that muddy territory where humans are forced to own up to our dependency on the land, I'm apt to be declared quaintly irrelevant by the small, acutely urban clique that decides in this country what will be called worthy literature. I understand their purview, I think. I realize I'm beholden to people working in urban centers for many things I love. They publish books, invent theater, produce films and music. But if I had not been raised such a polite Southern girl, I'd offer these critics a blunt proposition. I'll go a week without attending a movie or a concert. You go a week without eating food. And at the end of it, we'll sit down together and renegotiate quaintly irrelevant." I first started writing articles for magazines when people asked, and I got invited to a few early conferences. And people were, I think, fascinated, especially people from universities. I think some of them were a little embarrassed that this kid with a degree in Spanish literature actually knew more than they did about some areas in which they thought they should be experts. And there, I will admit, there were lots of times when I would be lecturing and I would mention some idea, and someone in the audience, one of the university types, would say, "Well, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. Where'd you get that ridiculous thing?" And I would look at my notes and I'd say, "Oh, well, that's from it turns out that's from a study by Smith and Jones done at Caltech, published in the Journal of so-and-so. Haven't you read it?" Well, it usually turned out that these guys were so convinced from the start, from the propaganda, that organic farming wouldn't work, that they weren't even reading their own literature. And this was utterly fascinating. And I would point out to them things. I would bring in copies of the United States Department of Agriculture yearbooks, the Yearbook of Agriculture for 1938. It had phrases in it that said, the continual use of chemical fertilizers tends to deplete the quality of the soil. I mean, this was written in the U.S. Department of Agriculture's own book. The book on soils for 1955, I think, had sentences in there like, when you don't have enough good things in the soil, the crop may look okay, but it isn't nutritious for the animals eating it. I mean, this was written right in the department's own literature, and they weren't even reading that. And so these ideas weren't new. It's just that they were ideas that nobody could sell. These were ideas only a farmer could benefit from, and so nobody was pushing them. And I was pushing them because I wanted to benefit farmers. I thought farmers were some of the nicest people I met, and all of them, including me, could use all this information. And as I traveled around and shared information with other farmers, this was the best thing. Farmers are the most generous people with information. I was always eager to share anything I'd learned with people, and farmers I met in France, in Germany, in Switzerland, all over the place, would gladly share ideas with me. And you put together 100 farmers who are all very much like me, and we're sort of pioneering their way into the new ideas. And by golly, you stir that around and pour it out, and you had one heck of a good way to do almost everything.
When I first moved over, Scott Nearing had been growing his garden there for 20 years or more. And I remember, I used to work with him part-time in his garden, seeing what I called old organic garden syndrome. And you would think it was getting better and better, but there seemed to be problems he was having that I wasn't having. And I think after a while, we need to think of, okay, is the pH getting too high with all this organic matter? Do we need to, because we are doing something unnatural, although we're using natural ingredients, we're adding an awful lot of organic matter, more than might be there normally. And that's why, even though there are a lot of people who are down on rototilling, I still think the rototiller is a wonderful tool, because if you look at the biological background of most annual plants, they're pioneer plants. They're the first thing that come in to cover disturbed soil in nature. So I'm sort of preparing disturbed soil for them. I wouldn't say that, definitely not true of perennials. They like a stable thing. But a lot of these annuals, and I don't know whether I'm right or wrong on this, I merely do things a second, third, fourth, and fifth year if they're working. If they're not working, I try and do something else.
I don't think I've ever noticed strongly the fact that the rest of the world hasn't bought into this idea, because ever since I started with it, it's been working so well for me. And anybody who came into our farm, to our farm stand and bought produce, they went away convinced, because the quality of the produce, the flavor, and the fact that there were no pest holes in it was pretty darn neat. And years ago, I remember I found a cartoon, I think it was in the New Yorker, and it was a cartoon, and it's in a laboratory where you expect science is taking place, and there's two characters, and one is looking up at the other, and the other is flapping his arms, and he's 10 feet off the ground. And the guy on the ground looking up at him is saying, yes, but without proper documentation. And in other words, he's looking at the miracle, and he can't wrap his mind around it. Well, that's what's been happening with organic farming. And very often, when someone from a university would come to our farm, the whole time that they were there, all the questions were trying to figure out why we couldn't be able to do what it was quite obvious in front of his eyes that we were doing. And in time, people are going to come around to it when you can see it right in front of your face. I mean, we weren't trying to fool anybody. We were doing it. We were having fun doing it. We were enjoying eating, and anybody who bought food from us was enjoying eating the food. So if the rest of the world refused to believe this, well, I felt bad for them. I didn't feel bad for us. I thought we were winning.
When soil is used to produce at its full potential, the soil on our own farms can provide everything we need in a low-work system by taking advantage of the synergy inherent in all the diverse pieces of the biology at our disposal. A fertile soil has the power to make the small farm ever more independent of purchased inputs, and ever more independent of the corporate industrial world. But the obvious question is this: if these systems work so well now, and were so clear to our predecessors, why has grass farming had to be rediscovered? Why have the benefits of organic matter and compost and crop rotation and mixed farming had to be rediscovered? Why have we never heard about movable greenhouses? They were devised 100 years ago. Logically, in a corporate-dominated world, any idea that leads to empowering the independence of individuals gets dismissed, gets overpowered by propaganda that typically derides such ideas as old-fashioned, outmoded, and unworthy of the modern way of life. If people know these things and begin to farm this way and can feed themselves and become autonomous and independent and can produce exceptional and unique food of high quality that attracts customers, but its production techniques can't be cheaply copied by industrial methods, this is dangerous competition to the bigger is better world. But we know differently. In the eyes of those of us who understand the benefits of producing food at the family farm scale, this is the way farms should be run and the way life should be.
When we started out in this game, and this goes back to 1965 when I first got interested, the only tools available for the small-scale commercial grower were almost identical to the tools that the small-scale commercial grower had been using 100 years before, because the development of tools for that size of production just hadn't continued, because everybody was focusing on big is better and bigger is even better than that. And so if I wanted to grow 1,000 acres of something, there were ideal tools for it. But if I wanted to grow 1.5 acres of intensive vegetables, the tools didn't exist. And we could picture what they would look like. I'm out there working, and I had, if this were made just differently, or if this were longer, or if I could put a little electric motor on that, wow, would that make life easier? And so we just started trying to find ways to get these made. Some of them we made in our shop. In some cases, we would find an engineer and convince him that he could have a little business making these.
What I suggest to these engineers to get them to do this is that this is actually a pretty neat business, because there isn't enough business for this for somebody with a big factory to steal the idea and try and put you out of business. So this is a pretty good deal for a small company. But I also say, make it really well. Use stainless. Make the thing so it just works fantastically, because I know I would rather pay an extra $100 to buy that and know it was going to work really well than save the $100 ahead.
Basically, we gave all the ideas away just to get them out there. And most of the time I would tell the people I gave them to, look, this is yours. You can go out and sell these wherever you want. All I want to do is be able to buy one, because this is a much better concept. And out of that came better hose, a small electric tiller, different tools for working the soil at different depths, different ways to put crops in the ground, different transplant systems. And we just had a wonderful time. And fortunately, there are people out there who aren't farmers, but who have the same passion for excellence that farmers have, and who get their joy out of making and producing objects that other people can use to make their lives easier. So we were able to locate them. They make the tools. They make their money doing that. I get to use the tools, and my life is happier.
Fortunately for the planet, the movement toward real food, toward local food, toward food produced with care by farmers who care, is the wave of the future. And it can't be stopped as long as we understand our advantages in working with the natural forces of the earth.
Organic farming has gone a long way from the way it was when I started. I mean, it was really, everybody looked at you as if you were some sort of head case for being interested in not using what was considered the most modern and fancy way of doing things. But in many cases, modern is merely a product that can be sold to you and that you can be convinced that you need, when actually the method that is being replaced, there was nothing wrong with it. It just needed to be tweaked slightly or slightly improved. And that's basically the case with farming. So the early organic farmers, when they started out, they realized, we've been trying these chemicals. We don't like the look of our crops. Our animals aren't as healthy. I think we need to figure out how to do a better job of what our ancestors had been doing. And they hadn't looked into it as thoroughly as they could have. And that's exactly what organic farmers have been doing. They've been taking age-old ideas and just doing them much better, making better compost, setting up better crop rotations, figuring out different ways in which there is a symbiosis between different parts of the biology on a farm. And those are the sorts of advancements that have been made. And so today, yes, the world is recognizing it, not because agriculture is recognizing it, but because consumers are recognizing it. You take a look at some company like Whole Foods, they have certainly grown a lot faster than the U.S. Department of Agriculture's interest in researching organic farming. But this is customer-driven. And whether that will go all the way, I don't know. I certainly hope it will, because there are many, many negative effects, such as the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, of the residues of fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides. And this is certainly not a nice thing for us as inhabitants of this planet to be doing. And if I could wave a magic wand and stop it today, I would like to do so. And I could do that honestly because I know that in reality, farmers don't need any of those things.
Rediscovering the immutable value of the small farm is the first step toward a new agriculture for the 21st century and possibly a new world of the 21st century. The social and cultural influence of the productive family farm can once again extend from the fertile soil under the farmer's feet far out beyond the boundaries of the farm itself. Back in 1915, when the percentage of small farmers was even higher than the desirable 20% that Paul Goodman envisioned, Cornell professor Liberty Hyde Bailey, who understood the power of the small farm and the farmer to make a difference in the world, wrote a little book entitled The Holy Earth, in which he summed up the heart of the situation in a few words. One does not act rightly towards one's fellow if one does not know how to act rightly toward the earth.
When I wrote my first book, The New Organic Grower, I think I wrote it mainly to pay back all those nice farmers who I had been visiting over the years, who had been kind enough to share information with me that had made my farming better. And so I thought, I really have a responsibility to pass this on because this is good stuff. And so that's basically how that first book came about. It was a chance to put down on paper these ideas so they wouldn't just die when my mind died. Then once we started playing around with the Winter Harvest, this concept was so much fun and was so successful. And even when we talked about it at lectures and showed pictures, I could tell most of the audience couldn't believe that we could actually do this. So for Season Harvest, we started with that because we had begun with these ideas on the home garden scale, and we figured home gardeners would like it. And then the Winter Harvest Handbook came about because then we next moved into doing these ideas on a commercial scale, and we wanted to inform commercial growers of what was going on. And basically just a case of passing on information, but trying to make very sure that we're passing on hard information that we know works because it's worked for us and we've done it for a long time. And in the future, well, I'd like to write a book just for beginning market gardeners, people in their first year, because I think we're going to need a lot more young farmers, and I'd like to encourage them and sort of hold their hand through the first year. And then the next step after that, I've long wanted to write a book entitled The Other Side of the Tapestry. And this comes about just from a little metaphor in my head, where the natural world I picture as a tapestry, a beautiful tapestry hanging from the ceiling. And the way I see it, it is the beautiful, most elegantly designed concept I have ever run across. But the people who do not see nature that way, I picture them standing on the back side of the tapestry. And what they're seeing is confusion, they're seeing strange threads and everything. And it's not that the scientists are not intelligent, they're brilliant, but their sciences, if I can invent words for them, would be called a random color hypothesis or stray thread theory. And it's just that they're standing on the back side of the tapestry and can't see how it works when you work with it as a farmer day to day and understand that as long as you plug into nature with the inputs that are part and parcel of the way she works, that you suddenly become aware how incredibly beautiful and elegant and how nicely these systems work.